Thank you all for joining us. I know that we are rich in great speakers and community events these last couple of weeks, so thanks for coming back out. I'm going to start by thanking our events committee, Teresa Rosano, Morgan Oster, Ashley Simone, Ella Parsons, and Khadija Didan. This is hard work. It is very rewarding work, and we love bringing these voices to Capla, to Tucson, to create community, create a studio culture. So on your end, please do your part and spread the word, come out. I can easily say maybe I'm a little biased, but it has not been a waste of our time at all with any of the speakers. It's been really great. I would also like to take this opportunity, and we're in a awkward point in terms of what I'm about to do, in terms of acknowledging that we are occupying the land of Indigenous people. I still want to take the opportunity to do so that we do this in a community where we celebrate the fact that we're both diverse and inclusive. So I'm not here representing or reading the university's land acknowledgement. I'm giving my own thanks for doing that, and the fact that there are 22 federally recognized Indigenous tribes in Arizona, and Tucson being home to the Odom and the Yaqui. Also, our next lecture will be on March 3rd. We're joined by Lorcan O'Hurley from LOH Architects in Los Angeles. Lorcan was going to join us last month, but unfortunately he had to reschedule because him, like so many people in Los Angeles, was affected by the fires. So he'll join us in March. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Rick Joy, who will introduce our guest tonight. Rick Joy is an important voice in the global discourse on conceptual and sustainable architecture. His work expresses innovation, exactitude, and modernism, and reflects a unique sense of place. Rick is an architect, a father, a husband, a musician, and a friend. So Rick, thank you.
Go very white on us.
Yeah, go for it. Go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce my friend, Daniel Toole. Is that the right name? No, just joking. Anyway, just a personal note, because I don't like being introduced myself, and I know he told me yesterday he doesn't like it either to be told about awards and stuff like that. But I've had the opportunity to teach around the world in different places. And in 2015, I was teaching a studio at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I had 15 students, and Daniel stood out really strongly. And I noticed after the first few times that I went to Boston and sat at his desk that I started lingering around a lot more at his desk because there was much more stuff. And he was the only student out of the 15 that every time I went showed up with more work. And it was because that, and a lot of students do this, you guys do it too, right? Where this professor comes in and you haven't done anything since the last time. And it wasn't the case with Daniel. So that was 2015. He graduated in 2016 and came to work in my office for a while. And we loved it, and wish he could have stayed longer. But he made it onto our website. He's still on there now, talking to Annalisa, and the back of his head is in one of the pictures. So that's like
My claim to fame.
it's his claim to fame. So I'd like to just introduce Daniel Toole, and it's remarkable how much he's done in this short period of time, and he's going to skyrocket. And looking forward to seeing more. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me? All right. Hopefully I don't have to keep my face too close to this thing. Thank you, Rick. That's like, I feel like I'm done. I flew down here just for that intro. That's an incredible honor. Make sure this works. So the talk will be called The Search, and just a little background. This is my 5th year of running my own practice. I did some of this stuff a little bit while working in other offices on weekends and at night. But yeah, I think it's just in preparing this lecture, this is the first time that I've like pushed everything together, so I should probably speed up. So in vein of the lecture series that Oscar's put together, the architecture of design, what I would like to try and do Of course, there are going to be some nice photos and nice renderings, but I'm going to try and do my best to talk a bit about what's under the hood on some of the projects from a design process standpoint, but also some of the things that I've had to deal with that have been pretty difficult. Awesome. So you might recognize this book. It's incredible to be here. This is not just a lecture at another architecture school that's away from my state. Tucson is a very important place in my life. And that journey, I just want to talk about that briefly before I show any work, began, I'd say 20 years ago when I found this book in Eugene, Oregon, which is a very different climate and very different landscape from here. And I remember finding this book and checking it out from the library, and it was on my desk, and I was just shocked by how different the materials looked, how different the landscape looked. There were so many plants I'd never seen before, and Oregon, from a relative standpoint, is not that far away. But it was interesting in preparing for this to realize that my journey here to this podium began 20 years ago. So fast forward 10 years, like Rick was talking about, it was my last year of grad school, and the list of option studios came out, and I saw Rick's name and excitedly marked his as my #1 choice. And it's a lottery system at GSD, so you never know who you're going to get. And I got into Rick's studio and super excited. And I don't know if it was out of fear of making sure that Rick thought that my work was good, or if it was coming off I took a year off in the 2 years of GSD to go work in Berlin, and the summer before that, this is something I'll tell the students, apply to as many travel scholarships as you can and use other people's money to go see architecture. That was like one of my #1 goals in grad school. So I got to go to Finland, Sweden, and Norway the summer before I had Rick. And so I think a big part of the stuff that we talked about at my desk might not have been my studio project, but it might have been the cool Alto books that were always on my desk. But needless to say, this project was definitely, maybe because the bar was so high with who was giving me desk crits. This is my favorite studio project I had in bachelor's or undergrad, or bachelor's or my master's. And this was a meeting hall on Princeton University's campus that I did under Rick. Yes, and my claim to fame, my biggest contribution to the architecture of Arizona is back of my head on the team photo here with Annalisa. And this experience here, I was literally to the week here for 1 year. And that experience was incredible. I tell everybody now, this is the only time ever in my career so far where I got to work on architecture within architecture. And that's such a rare, special thing. And I didn't realize that till going on to other offices. It's such a unique sanctuary that you get to work in Rick's office. And the other thing too, besides Rick, I learned so much from the people that I worked with there. It was, for only being there a year, I feel like, and I'm going to talk about some of how my experience in this room directly affected some of the projects later. But just having such talented people next to you, I'm sure, just like in studio, it's good if you're next to someone whose work you admire because it raises your bar. But this office, the way that Rick and Claudia have curated the types of people that come here from all over the world and are very talented, it was just a formative experience for me, although short. And these are just a couple photos that I found from the time that I was here. It's a little courtyard at the entry to the Tucson Herb Store. Take a mental picture of that. This is a place I like to go on weekends with a coffee and sit. And then one time walking home with groceries downtown and standing out in the rain trying to capture lightning with a cell phone, getting soaked, but it's a very fond memory of mine. And the other thing that makes this so special is during the year that I was here with Rick, I met my lovely wife, who's here in the back with my 2 kids, and my family, who all is here in Arizona and Tucson. So this is a very emotionally significant place to share my work. And I just want to thank everybody for inviting me and being here. So the search is named after a book that I recommend you go check out from the library. It was written in 1960, 5 years before Corbusier died. And it's a beautiful kind of collage of a book, and it documents the whole formation of his attitude towards everything from architecture to urban design towards painting. And it's a really beautiful book. It's relatively affordable, but it is also, all the graphic design was done by Corbusier, and it's very collaged, but also there are travel sketches from when he was like a teenager in here. So there's a lot of like naive things that some other architects might cover up and not want to share with the world. And I'm sure it's still curated, but this book is called, I don't know what the original title was, but the English translation is Creation is a Patient Search. And I would say that for me, in these first 5 years of working, if I'm honest, my search is not patient. When I get a new project, I get very anxious. I get excited, but I'm also like, oh man, I wonder if I can measure up to my last project. I wonder, is this next one going to be that good? Do I have what it takes to live up to, this next one? So there's a lot of doubt and anxiety, but also a lot of excitement and a lot of potential. And I hope that that's kind of a thing of youth, but that's the honest truth. Mine has not been a patient search. I'm always really anxious to try and find the idea. So creation also, I think, or the architecture of design, the kind of internal workings of design process, I think are heavily shaped by our backgrounds. And I'm sure that there are many backgrounds in this school and in this room. And I think, especially as I've started to work on multifamily housing, it's forced me to start to think about what types of places I lived growing up. So I grew up caught between two cultures. I grew up for the most part in Southeast Portland, which is mostly suburbs, cul-de-sacs, right on the edge of the woods, but a lot of stuff that looks just like this house. I actually lived in this neighborhood my senior year in high school. My mother is a Hungarian refugee from Budapest. So every 4 years or so, we'd go visit my grandmother and my uncle in Budapest when I was a kid. And that was a very big contrast to what I was, spending most of my time in, which was strip malls, Applebee's, the typical suburban sprawl of most American cities. And I think that contrast has definitely affected the way that I see the world and the way that I see cities, and I think the way that I make decisions when designing architecture. On the left, this was a favorite childhood memory. This is a Art Nouveau hotel in Budapest. Budapest has a tremendous amount of thermal hot springs under the city. And despite being dominated and ruled over by the Turkish Empire for a very long time, and then the Soviet Empire, a lot of these beautiful turn of the century and even older baths are still preserved in the city. So when I was a kid, I loved this place. It's called the Gellert Hotel, and there's a retractable roof over the pool in the middle. And I have memories of this place from, I don't know, age 5 and on. But then simultaneously, especially as I think more in the realm of housing, this was my grandma's apartment building my entire life, somewhere around that floor in this building. And this is prefabricated, huge post-war Soviet housing block on the north of Budapest. And from my childhood on till when she passed away somewhat recently, she lived in the same apartment in this otherwise very anonymous and very not necessarily in the nice sense that we might have for it now, like a pretty brutal housing estate. And that experience, though, of seeing how different people in these estates would personalize their environment, I'm sure left a lasting impact. In the Pacific Northwest is definitely not all that bad. This is the Clackamas River on the left, where I spent as much time as possible as a kid, pretending to learn how to fish, camping, learning to drive with my dad. And there wasn't a lot of money as a kid, but we would often come in from the suburbs, and there's a beautiful neighborhood that was an old streetcar neighborhood for when Portland was primarily a dock working town. And it's full of these beautiful one-bedroom apartment buildings. Most of them are 4 stories. There's a couple 5 and even a couple 6. And my office is in the second floor of this one. And it's just really nice. Growing up in Oregon, I left for a full decade before returning right after my time here in Tucson. And now we live about 7 minutes walk up this street. So to be back where in a very special place from childhood to do my work is a privilege. Another thing, I spent a year in Paris during my bachelor's as part of an exchange program. And I'd say that year it was split between New York City and Paris. And that year, just from a biographical standpoint, that year was the most important year. No offense to Rick's studio, but that was the most important year for sure, because I literally got dropped into New York City from the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, and I'd never seen, as a young adult, never seen, this complexity, this richness, and then to go to Paris right after and see, many, many centuries of urban history, and then some of the most modern pieces of significant architecture like the Centre Pompidou and the plaza out front. And this photo was taken at La Tourette Monastery by Corbusier that's outside of Lyon. And I took this by climbing onto one of the roofs in the middle after you're supposed to be in your little cell for the night. So I think this photo was taken at midnight, just kind of crouched up on the side. But that building is mind-blowing if you get a chance to visit it. Most of Corbusier's stuff is pretty good. And then most recently, right before meeting Rick, I thought going to grad school would be easy since I had 5.5 years of work experience, but actually it was incredibly hard because most people were younger than me and could stay up 3 nights in a row and just design for 72 hours straight. And I realized, okay, maybe I need to take a year off. And I got a research scholarship in Berlin. And that seed had been planted in high school, actually. An English teacher showed us this movie, Wings of Desire, which is a really beautiful movie if you haven't seen it. It's about just before the wall falls in Berlin, or just after the unification of East and West Berlin. And it's from angels' perspectives, flying over Berlin and seeing people in their day-to-day lives. But the role of architecture in this film, I did not think about this way when I was in high school. But there was something about this movie that haunted me from high school on. So I knew I needed to go there at some point in life. So a year there was incredible, getting to spend time with, a very ruined city that's on its way back in many different ways through many different architects from all over the world's hands. Mies, Schinkel, all that stuff. These are some travel sketches. I think travel sketching is incredibly important in the day of Instagram and iPhones. I'm sure you've heard it 100 times, but nothing beats sketching and traveling and seeing things in person. These are just some favorite outtakes of sketchbooks from over the years. This is an Alto sketch from that time I was talking about. I think that sketch was done at midnight as well, where the sun never sets in the summer in Finland. One thing I haven't done it recently, but something I used to like to do when I'd visit a city with a special character for the first time on the plane back, I'd try and do a watercolor sketch to capture the essence of what was different about that city. So this was on the plane coming back from Venice, and you always freak out the person next to you and you start splashing watercolors all over your little tray, but it's worth it. So I'm going to talk about our work, and I've tried to categorize the work under 5 words that seem to show up quite often in our office. And my office right now is myself and 2 others. And I'll talk about them briefly at the end, but Jason and I actually work together at Rick Joy. I'm sure some of you know him and his wife, who were here in Tucson at the same time as I was. So it's just been awesome to carry a lot of the things that we learned in Rick's office into very different types of work. But these words come up quite often. And this is the first time that I'm going to start with the more, I'd say, city work. As I was putting this together, first of all, I thought I would be doing houses for the first 10 years of my practice. And then I had an amazing developer client reach out that saw a house that I'd done in Seattle and gave me an opportunity to try multifamily. And Ryan has become an incredible partner in some of the work that you're going to see here. So I'm going to start with the urban work for the first time. Because I realized in putting this together at this point now, half of our work is city building and half of it is houses, which is kind of cool to realize. So order, I'd say with city work, or work in a city or in an urban context, there is so many things going on simultaneously that are working against you and your idea of how to make something great. You know, there are zoning, there are infrastructural issues that you might not even realize till you already came up with a scheme that you're in love with already. There's budget constraints that can change while you're designing. There's neighborhoods and communities. There's a lot of things to try and balance. And I think that order has been, for me thus far, fundamental in setting up a design process and an idea that can become strong enough to endure those different constraints. And it's much different than in a house, I feel, just because you basically have to come up with a diagram that has the strength to endure just multiple years of filtration that's trying to change it. And I'm pretty excited. I'm going to take off on a 40th birthday trip tomorrow to go for a week to see the work of Louis Kahn, projects that I've never gotten to see. I'm going to go to the Kimball tomorrow for the first time. So you're going to see some Kahn quotes in here too, because I've been reading all my books this year in anticipation of a trip that starts right after this. And I really like this image. It's a Donald Judd piece from 1980 done in plywood. And I really like this piece. Donald Judd is a master of proportion and kind of clarifying and refining things down to their bare essence. But I like that this piece is done in a non-precious material of plywood. And I think particularly in housing, you don't usually get very precious materials. So you need to find, you can see here, this is plywood, but there's a very specific system of order that brings it a dignity and elevates it to be something different than just some plywood leaning against a wall. Also, there's an order inherent in most cities and in typology and block structure. This is early Berlin. Berlin has huge blocks, and there are these incredible networks of inner spaces called Hofs. And this is just a particular example where you can see those courtyards and how they're interconnected. So I think that's one thing that's always been very inspiring for me, is drives my wife nuts and my friends nuts. But whenever I'm in a new city, I like to sneak into the courtyards, the alleyways, try and follow someone through a gate to really see the inner life of those places. And in my hometown here, these aren't the greatest photos of it, but in that same neighborhood that my office is in, it's full of these timber framed, masonry wrapped housing blocks from the turn of the century. And I know that they were done quite quickly, but they have these beautiful, almost hidden courtyards within them. This is my favorite one. It's got, it was before the last clinker brick manufacturer closed down in Oregon, but it has this crazy kind of serrated bond skin. And just this building also has fireplaces in some of the units. They're just certain things in the realm of housing that you might take for granted in high-end residential architecture that's just not common practice anymore in multifamily. And I think that walking around these types of buildings every day, I know is a great benefit for me, and it gives me something to hold my work in the city against. Because even though these buildings are over 100 years old, people always want to live in them. So the first project I did actually started my first studio at GSD. I got an email from a developer asking me if I'd come down to Miami and look at an alleyway that they wanted to preserve. And when I lived in Seattle for 5.5 years after I finished undergrad in 2008, and I became obsessed with alleys. I really love this series of books called Pamphlet Architecture. Should check those out if you've never seen them. And they're these beautiful little brochures about different housing typologies or stairs or just very specific topics zoomed in on in a focused manner. So I made alleys my pamphlet while I lived in Seattle. So I thought someone was joking. I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick on me when I got this email. So I'd never been to Miami before. I came down. The project takes place here. This is a photo from the 20s when this whole area was pineapple farms. And eventually, starting with this building, which my project fronts, this started to become a place where furniture and textiles were imported and stored in Miami. Now it's called the Miami Design District. So this is a little bit about a book and an exhibit that the AIA Seattle facilitated. I think the second year after I finished undergrad, I won the AIA Seattle's got this really great program where they allow young professional to go abroad and research a topic to come back and try and improve city of Seattle with. So I got the second inaugural one to look at alleys. And I wrote this little book to kind of capture some of the sketches and experiences I had in alleys in Australia, Japan, San Francisco, Detroit, Chicago. And that's how the development team found me. They were like, you're the only person that's ever written a book on alleys. So when I showed up there in 2013, this is what it looked like. It was full of transformers, cigarette butts, and dumpsters. And initially, the group brought me down, I think, more for ideas about what alleys are supposed to be. I don't even know if they knew I was an architect, and I wasn't a licensed one at that point. But I realized quickly, I was like, I got to sit down and start sketching. This is an opportunity to actually finally, I'd been dreaming for 5 years in Seattle of doing some type of architectural intervention in an alley, and it just never happened in Seattle. So I asked, can I sit down and just sketch a little bit with the master planning team? Oh, sure. So I had never been to Miami, and I had never been in a place so heavily impacted by, I'd say, Spanish colonial architecture. So there's just a tremendous amount of masonry, arches, arcades, just things that are very different from the building culture where I'm from. But I thought, I can't just do arches. That's wrong. I gotta think of some way to make arches my own for this project, to at least try to. And I remembered visiting La Tourette, the monastery by Corbusier that I talked about. I remember going here. I remember getting off at a tiny little bus stop with a classmate, and we walked up this super long hill in torrential downpour, and we were covered in mud. We went through goat pastures and all kinds of stuff. And then when you get up the hill, you don't see the front door because the entry is on the back, on the uphill side. So we made our way up through under the building. So we're even more covered in mud. But I remember finding these really strange, seem to have almost no order arches deep under the building. And I just remember making a mental note of it and just being so taken aback by how strange they were. And they almost looked free-handed. So I remembered those, I don't know, 10 years later when I started to work on this alley. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something there. Maybe I can make it more personal approach to an arch. And I thought about, I knew that there was a new building coming. I thought, how could I introduce a structured order and kind of a scale breakdown and a rhythm to this otherwise pretty leftover space? And I produced 3 different schemes that day, and this was the first one, and it stuck, it resonated. So this is kind of an axon of the block that it's sleeved in, and they gave us another project, but that project got done too quickly, so I'm not going to show that one. But yeah, so throughout grad school, I did CA from my desk at GSD, which made it even harder. But I learned to use a laser cutter before the second presentation one night. I stayed up all night trying to figure it out. Made this model, had it on my lap on the plane from Boston down to Miami, and I think people were worried that I might have a weapon or something, because I was just like, don't bump it. And that really helped. The light in Miami is, in a sense, kind of similar to here, where you have very crisp shadows, so that helped a lot. I lost this model, unfortunately, but that helped seal the deal. And next semester, it was under construction, which was really awesome to be able to go from my studio desk to go down to Miami and do CA and do to some extent, real arches with real formwork. This is the day it opened. And so we got to intervene on the back of that building that you saw in the black and white historic photos here, which from an urban standpoint, this is quite cool. These were trash rooms, and working with a developer, we had the idea these could be incubator, short-term lease places where this neighborhood, the Miami Design District, everything is, Louis Vuitton, the most luxurious retail stuff, and there's not really places for small businesses to start out. But these have all been successfully leased by small businesses in Miami, which is awesome. I think people were a little hesitant at first because they were worried that nobody would go in an alley in Miami, but it's actually become kind of a little icon in the neighborhood. And it's probably my favorite project just because I get to go down maybe once every 2 years, and something dramatically has changed each time, and it's really become part of the city. These are just pictures of how the light works. And plants in Miami just grow like crazy. There's an incredible amount of, there was a family of parakeets that landed in these trees that we planted at the beginning. Yeah, there's one of the smaller spaces that was I think it's like a 21 and over ice cream parlor that now has 8 different locations in Florida, but their first shop was here in this alley. And actually, Pharrell just opened a sushi restaurant right here, which is kind of cool. I haven't seen that yet. But just the light, shadow, and then also just notice the arches. Some of them come and break down in the middle, drop down into the middle of the alley, so you're forced to negotiate these things and slow your passage through the space. Another thing to point out that's interesting that really freaked me out when it happened, but all of a sudden it became clear that with so much weight in these arches, they could not be structurally attached to the neighboring buildings. So if you look here on the side, you can see these reveals. They're not touching the neighboring buildings at all. They're vertically cantilevered from these deep grade beams that run about 3 feet deep under the alley. And it creates a nice tension. But at the beginning, there were so many things in this project, like, oh, we got to move this arch, we got to move this arch. And you think the project is going to fall apart, but then you just learn to roll with it and respond, and it's okay. And one thing, it doesn't show up in these, but another curveball that happened was they stuck outdoor outlets in the bottom of the arches and didn't tell me. And I got there, I was like, no, what did you do? But then I realized that everybody takes their lunch breaks that works in the neighborhood in this alley and plugs their cell phones into the arches. So kind of cool. And it's interesting to see what types of, I've seen weddings and graduations, all kinds of things happen. It's just interesting when an alleyway goes back and becomes part of the community in the city. It's interesting to see how people use it. There's a night. So the next project is our first housing project, and this project will actually finish in about 8 weeks. So it's the first time I'm showing some CA photos of it. But this was a single family house before that was actually a lampshade shop, the one and only in Oregon, across from a huge power transformer. And we managed to fit 16 individual units into this one lot, which I had never done. I was telling Oscar in one of the housing studios before, I had never even done housing in a design studio in school. I had this amazing client. He saw a house that I'd done. He's like, oh, it's not rocket science. He'll figure it out. But it was like a second master's degree, just learning. Portland is like a notoriously difficult permitting process, learning all the different building code to get this much density smashed in. This area is a very industrial thoroughfare, and there are a handful of kind of old schools and churches that are done in brick, and those are definitely the more standout architecture amongst mostly corrugated automotive warehouses and very industrial fabric. So the initial idea for the project was like, oh, this is going to be a brick beacon in this neighborhood to announce new multifamily and bringing density to an underserved part of the city. So I got really excited and designed this beautiful brick facade system that was trying to be true to the fact that it's a framed building. This actually started out as mass timber for the floors, but it's 2x6s. It's stick frame. Most things in the Pacific Northwest are stick frame. So we tried to be true tectonically with the masonry, that at night and even during the day that you start to understand that it's really a veneer with these screens in areas that they can occur. So it almost feels like, we called it like a corduroy jacket over the wood building. After getting the permit, all of a sudden I get an email, Dan, we got to strip 40% of the budget out of the project. I know you just got the permit, but we're going to start pouring foundations in 8 weeks. So I need you to redesign it in some ways, redesign the facade, redesign the structural system in 8 weeks, and get a revision in as well. And that, I remember from Rick's talks, one of his points was architecture is hard. And that was my first lesson of architecture being hard, for sure. I went home nearly in tears, and my wife's like, you can't afford to not do this project, so you better figure out how to make it happen. So thank you, babe. So we're like, okay, well, maybe we try and respond to the actual neighborhood, and maybe it's a metal building, and maybe it's all galvanized to respond to the big electrical substation across the street. And maybe that we keep the interior wood to kind of soften that once you enter the building. So it became this kind of, the massing and the articulation had all been done up until this point as a brick wrapped building. So to have to click really quick. And I think one of the things, just to be honest, I think one of the things that I tell people that work with me that was great to realize here is because we had worked so much on proportion and scale and refinement to all these other layers of the architecture, and then had to have this big fundamental change happen, it actually allowed, it went smoother than I thought it would. I thought the world was over when this happened, but actually you realize if you work diligently at all the different other aspects of the order of a building, it can withstand quite a bit. Pretty simple, just corrugated metal, perforated on the here where the exterior circulation happens. And then there's 2 stair towers on the back and a courtyard between the 2 stair towers. You can see it's all framed 2x6s and plywood. And this was a few weeks ago. The metal and the perforated skin are starting to come together quickly. Each of these units is, each one of those cells is 1 unit. They're about 350 square feet plus a 50 square foot covered deck. And in Pacific Northwest, covered outdoor space is a luxury because it rains so much. This is kind of the materiality. And we've, all of us in the office have worked so carefully with a pretty modest team of craftsmen and modest budget to really understand, go to all the sheet metal fabricators, warehouses, look at their tools, understand how they're doing things, and try and come up with ways that both of us can get on board with. Spacing of fasteners, the type of head on the screw, and just, it's been, of course, a lot of friction, but it's been an extremely rewarding process because there's usually a certain point where people are frustrated with you and don't want to see you at the site anymore. But then once it starts to come together, they're like, oh, this is actually really cool. And they become proud of the work. So that's been a good learning lesson. This is the interior. So all the interior space is all exposed wood framing and then cedar skin on the inside. So there's this kind of contrast that when you come into the building where your body will actually rub up against and touch as you get to your apartment, it's warmer than the outside. Kitchens just started going in on Monday before I flew here. And Hunter is the superintendent, a young guy that actually came to my final reviews at a studio I taught last year. And it's just been really cool to have someone that's learning at the same time as we are, so we can all do it together. And that's definitely been a good thing. So you can kind of see it's not done yet. 8 weeks or so, it'll be mostly done. But it's become almost this twin of the infrastructure across the street. And this street here is a border between 2 neighborhoods. So it's become this almost under the radar like grand entry between these 2 neighborhoods, built out of very infrastructural materials. But I'm proud of all the work that has yielded something that people are quite proud of. So literally 2 blocks west, this is our building a few months ago. And this is a very ubiquitous mid-century housing type brick courtyard housing. Someone gave our developer the opportunity to purchase this lot that's about 4 times the size of the project I just showed you. So we're working on that right now. And that, I was mentioning this in the housing studio earlier, that's placed such a unique situation for me to, housing hasn't been built in this neighborhood probably since some of this stuff from the 50s. I mean, there's a couple little things here and there, but it's a chance to really shape the neighborhood. So that can also be a pretty daunting task, given that the goal is to use a lot of the same tradespeople, scale, it's the same zoning. This was an initial sketch, and this was after some hard lessons learned about control over window materials and sizes being heavily based on the manufacturer's standard sizing. I wanted to decouple the facade with windows and the facade of the facade that kind of creates the presence of the architecture. At the same time, that outdoor covered space, it's like, why can't we get more of that in each unit? So there became this kind of two-layered scheme for this building. And I assumed that we'd use the same galvanized metal siding on this project, but after working really hard to try, even though it's the same building type, same zoning, same scale, even some of the same unit types. There's a bigger mix, but a developer texted me one weekend, one word, Core 10. I was like, no, I don't want to do Core 10. Like, okay, we'll look at it. And we rendered it, and we looked at it, and it's like, oh, and so caveat is like Core 10 is like come to Portland hard the last 5 years. So you can see Whole Foods with Core 10 on them. I'm sure you can here too. So I was just, I was a little hesitant to do it. But once we rendered it, it was like, oh, this kind of responds to the brick materiality across the street, and it sets us apart materially from the project that we're just finishing 2 blocks away. So let's just roll with it. And it's become quite cool. Also, much higher use of perforated material so that these massive kind of horizontals dematerialize as the time of day shifts, and depending on how you're looking into the building, you'll be able to see, you know, people's bikes and kayaks and house plants at night. And that's the first building back here. And there's a big community courtyard in the middle of these 2 buildings, and then smaller courtyards, all exterior circulation. So even exterior stairs on this one, which I'm excited about. And this courtyard has these kind of pavilions for summer and rainy season enjoyment for the residents outside. These are the stair courts. And then this project is in a different neighborhood. This is actually the next one to go into construction. It's a 50 by 100 foot lot right at the edge of a primarily single family neighborhood and a huge built up high density corridor. So the scale jumps from 2-story single family houses to up to 6-story mixed use buildings. And the massing of this building, we can take a height bonus and go up to 5 stories on the main street. But over here, because we're next to a single family zone, we have to be 3 stories. So for about a month, I had this weird, like a kid's drawing of a whale massing. And it's like, oh, why don't we just accept it and terrace the entire top? Because we have an elevator and stair in the middle. And then it was like, oh, and it's going to be mass timber. And we're not using CLT. We're using something, I don't have a great picture of it. You'll see in the rendering, but it's like a kind of a poor man's CLT. It's a really thick plywood. Like it literally just looks like regular plywood, but it's in up to 11-inch panels, and it's made about an hour from Portland. So this building will be made of mass plywood with another kind of iteration of the Galvalume skin, and then this terraced roof. And we had a family-owned door hardware manufacturer cast that in steel and then hot dip galvanize it. And I had no clue how heavy this little thing would be. It's like 12 pounds. And these models are on display right now in Portland, which is cool. It's a bigger model to kind of start to study where the perforation and the proportioning of the facades would happen and the articulation of the structure. Models are important. This one, I'd say, definitely came later when we started to realize we're grappling with so many systems, and because it's mass timber, there's not a lot of place to hide services. So having to be real about that, I realized, okay, we have a little downtime once we submitted the initial permit. Let's build a big model so we can use this to meet with all the consultants, so we have a better chance of things actually going the way we want them to. But it's definitely one of the more interesting, bigger models we've done. But typically, I'd say you'll see a few more in the houses. We start with a small, almost totem-like model. And that's something I saw very successfully used at Allied Works while I was there. It's a model that's not necessarily the building, but it sets a tone and a kind of attitude towards the site of what a project could be. So you'll see some of those as well, just renderings. There's retail on the ground floor, and actually there's live work on the shorter side of the building, and our office is hopefully going to be in one of the lofts on the back there. There's a shared courtyard in the middle, and for a 50 by 100 foot site, there's a lot going on in this building. It's been a whole other learning experience, and we haven't even started construction yet. So all the circulation is kind of this post-pandemic attitude of exterior circulation, no corridors, there's fresh air. All the units have double exposures, so there's air and light from both sides of units, even though quite a few of these are quite small. There's a community roof deck on the lower terrace and a community room that's shared by the whole building, whether you work in retail or you live in one of the units or you have your live work. And then moving up to the top tier, these are 3 lofts that have their own private roof decks that are accessed by these spiral staircases that are all hot dip galvanized. There's some of the units, and you can see that mass plywood, which literally just looks, it's just fir plywood. It's just super thick. Kitchens and kind of a Juliet balcony in the living room. And this is one of the lofts inside. You can see these beams are all made of the same plywood, so that they can be post beams or floor systems or wall systems. We were going to try to have mass timber walls in here, but we learned too much that Portland being a seismic zone, it does not, you don't want to use mass timber in a seismic zone. So yeah, this is definitely the most mix of uses that we've been presented with, and we're just on the cusp of pulling the permit. So moving into some of the houses, especially coming out of Rick's office, mass. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, everything is articulated within the most recent history of modern architecture. You know, it's from stick frame, beautiful post and beam mid-century buildings to steel frames in Olsen Kundig's work. There's just a lot of articulation of members. And I think one of the biggest things I saw here in Tucson, I was just shocked, is like how thick walls could be in the work that we were doing at Rick's office, but also in the vernacular here. It's just such a different building culture, and I was not used to that. So got an opportunity to do some friend's parents' house that I'd been asking if I could do it for about a decade, and finally they let me do it with a mentor of mine. And we had an awesome time trying to translate some of the things that I was seeing down here into the material palette and constructional systems of the Northwest. So I'd say also, I've always loved Noguchi's work. I remember finding his museum randomly on a visit to New York in Queens, and I think I'd seen, you know, his light fixtures, but I'd never seen the body of sculptures that's there, and just such an intense life within materiality, and the way that he can bring nature into a solid block of matter. There's something, yeah, it just moved me very deeply to see his work, but also frustrated me because architecture has so many pieces, mostly. Like, it's made up of so many fasteners and layers and whatnot, that Noguchi's work is frustrating to try and think about architecture this way, because the limits help so much, I feel. But it's also a very, very nice thing to come back to. His mentor, Brancusi, the Romanian French sculptor that Noguchi studied under for a while, his work also is just dealing with these very elemental masses of matter. I think those have definitely been something that I've enjoyed looking at quite a bit, and trying to see, is there anything of this that I can try and bring into the reality of buildings. And of course, the work of Kahn. When Kahn died, a handful of people from his office moved to Oregon, to the University of Oregon. I think because of the attitude towards the Vietnam War, but also just to get away from the East Coast. So when I was in undergraduate, there was still this kind of, there was a few of them left, and there was this kind of lingering ghost of the way Kahn taught architecture hanging around my school, and I tried to pursue those people. So Kahn's work has been present in my life for a very long time, and I'm very excited to start this tour tomorrow. This was a site behind this garden wall. My friends who I got the project through were raised in this house here, kind of Queen Anne, larger bungalow in Seattle. We had this idea of, okay, if we can't do an all masonry house, but the wife was Swiss, and she always dreamed of living in a concrete house where their garden was when they retired, so they could sell their house and build this all concrete house. Started working on an all concrete house. The husband got freaked out. He's like, what are the neighbors gonna think? That's a little too harsh. Okay, so we'll do a wood upper, the part that's visible, and a concrete lower part that's carved, and try and unify the whole language of the house. Pretty simple plan. They spend a lot of time outdoors, even though it's raining. So there's a courtyard on axis with the entry. This is kind of the public space of the house: living, dining, kitchen, an office that can be converted to a bedroom if either of them needs it for aging in place, and then a bedroom on the lake side, and a guest bedroom on the street side, and then this is a big green roof. You can see neighbors are 8 and 6 feet away on the side, so we really had to play with how to diffuse this kind of in Seattle, typically very thick, wet, gray light. So the first thing we did was open the north facade. Definitely probably was somewhat influenced by that wall at Rick's office and seeing how the light moved across it all the time. And I thought, if we can open the walls to the sky, we can get light in here and not have to look into your neighbor's bathroom. This is kind of the unified mass and starting to work to really understand how to control the formwork, the concrete. This is all used with slightly damp cedar boards that before the pour had dried out and opened up. So these fins came through, and the contractor sent me a picture and freaked out after the first pour. Oh, the wood was too wet. I was like, no, we got to keep that. It looks awesome. That's the client after the living room wall was poured. The formwork itself was just intense. That was a whole learning process in itself, and having to locate all the outlets and plumbing fixtures and light switches, and literally the builder whose house I'm going to show next was one man with a pickup truck. And I had no clue how this was going to come together, but it really came together incredibly. This is called the Madrona house. So you can see the presence of that concrete just exposed throughout the ground floor. And I think this house, actually even the housing before, it's interesting. I must be from the Northwest because I think the buildings look their best on really overcast, damp days, which is nice. And you get sunrise with that diffuse light coming from the sky simultaneously in the living room, which is definitely my favorite room. There's a kitchen garden. They do a lot of cooking and growing their own herbs out there, and then the courtyard at the heart of the home, the double-sided hearth. And then we have operable skylights that are on temperature sensors, so when it reaches a certain temperature inside, the skylights open and passive stack ventilation kicks in, because they were really against air conditioning, which is very atypical for a house of this cost in Seattle. That's a view from their master bedroom to Lake Washington. And they sleep on the floor. They're in their 70s. They sleep on the floor, and they love having the windows open all throughout the year. It's pretty awesome. It's like a tree house up there. It's a green roof. So tectonic is next, and I really like this quote. Kahn has a lot of great quotes about the origins of a column. When a wall parted and column emerged, that was the beginning of architecture. He says, but this is also a great one. And how structure's relationship to light is very intrinsic. So Phil, the builder of that last house, is a carpenter who met his wife framing houses. So both of them are incredible wood craftsmen, and Phil just has like this incredible love for wood. So halfway through construction of that last house, he asked me if I'd be willing to put a master bedroom addition on his house. Like, oh, okay. And quickly that turned into a whole new house, which is awesome. And it's going along slowly, but the craft of the home is something I'm really excited. It's probably going to take another couple years to finish up, but I was really inspired by not trying to hyper articulate all the layers of wood structure, but create something more monolithic almost. I knew with the reality, there's no driveway to get to this house. It's in the city, and it's up this treacherous Indiana Jones style stair here. So all the materials had to be carried up here, except for this neighbor allowed them 2 times to use their driveway. So we poured the foundation from a truck on the side, but everything else has been taken up the side here. So I thought naively, since I don't have much hands-on construction experience other than CA and annoying builders, I thought that 6x12s and 6x6 timbers would be manageable for 2 people to carry up the stairs, but they're quite heavy. So we also, this is the first project where we started to do these kind of almost like a kid's book collage. And I know there's been a lot of collage used in architecture recently, but there's something I wanted to do that renderings is just this like infinite tail chasing loop of, oh, you got to get that 1/4 inch reveal right, et cetera. And I did that in the first house, and I just felt like I overdid it on some things. And it's just like, does everything need to have a 1/4 inch reveal? No. Okay, well, let's try and come up with a rendering that serves as kind of the guidepost for the project that's more like something you'd see in a kid's book. And that's become, we haven't got to do it on each project, but when we have got to do it, it's been powerful. So responding to the existing footprint, it worked out to be almost a perfect 9 square grid. Bedrooms are on this more compact floor. And then up top, there's literally just this kind of core with a pantry, bath, and kitchen. And then the rest is this open pavilion with a covered deck that he specifically asked for. And he never had views of the lake. So we went up a full story and went down a full story. So all of a sudden his house tripled in size, and everything, the windows, the structure, the decking is all rough sawn Doug fir from Oregon and Washington. It's a model. That's the system that Phil rigged up to take. Even the plumber rides this thing up the hillside, which is pretty crazy. In the middle of the city. It's kind of like a miner's winch to pull materials up. These are from a few weeks ago. It's down in the basement. And that's Phil with some of the decking going on the structure. And this is a view from the living room, so you can see the lake for the first time since he's lived here since 1990. One rendering to show what it'll be like in the future. But the rendering is very hard to capture like a rough sawn fir texture in a rendering. That's the view of Mount Rainier out of the living room, which is incredible. This project's on Anderson Island, just a little bit south. It's for an awesome couple, the Forches from Seattle. They bought this small piece of property, actually not small, nice piece of property overlooking the Puget Sound. And this is a first sketch from a site visit a few years ago now. We're just trying to wrap all the program for their extended family around the clearing of this meadow. Some very early sketches the first month, talking about the search, just what does this want to be? Charcoal drawings, starting to get a little more specific. Site plan. And this project too, I'd say one of the greatest things I saw in Rick's office happening, besides Rick himself, I saw people my age doing hand drawings. And that was super inspiring. I'd done it a little bit when I lived in Seattle, but this project was the first one where it was like, I'm going to draw the plan. In the beginning stage, I'm only going to do hand drawings. And that's been, especially for the houses, that's been a very special thing to do. An early model. The southern bend in the house was around this huge snag of a tree that eagles lived in, and it sadly has fallen over during permitting. So that kink in the plan is a ghost reminder of what was there. So this is approaching from the land, and you see the sea beyond. And it's all Doug fir and plywood, exposed plywood on the walls with kind of a driftwood color stain to unify everything. View out onto the sound. And we have these moments that are openable. So winters are pretty brutal and wet, and summers it's very pleasant. Pacific Northwest, so there are moments that can open and close. Sanctuary. This house is another architecture is hard lesson. This house had an incredible client who had this great collection of custom furniture with all these crazy gadgets and things built in. He's a neurosurgeon, very smart guy, but interested in gadgets and nice materials. So the first meeting, I was like, oh, this is going to be a great project. And then the site had this huge 30-foot long lava flow outcropping right in the middle of the site and steep slopes all the way around. It's like, how am I going to build a house up here on this? And it was above the tree line in about an hour and a half south of Seattle. So it's just this very complicated site with this behemoth of a rock growing out of the middle, covered in moss, and this thing had been geodated, thousands of years old. And I was like, well, I got to somehow protect this rock in what we do here, but I'm working against setbacks on every single side. How am I going to do that? And this incredible view, Seattle is up here somewhere, and this is the southern tip of the Puget Sound. So this is actually saltwater, the furthest south that it comes into the state of Washington. So we had these incredible views, this incredibly rich geological situation on this site, and it was all in a clearing. So this project, I started to do some watercolors at the beginning of like what it quickly came on. The name came on as the Rock House. What does that mean? What does that look like? Also, it was in an area where there aren't a lot of architect design homes. So it was the first time I had to face the reality of trying to have a budget that was realistic for the market should they need to relocate. So I knew it would have to be wood, which is kind of not what you think of when you think of a rock house. So how could I make a wooden cave around this big outcropping? So there was about a month spent just in watercolor sketches. And I remember bringing these to the first client meeting along with the model I'm about to show you. And I just remember on the drive up thinking like, he's either going to think this is amazing and awesome, or he's going to fire me at this meeting. What are you using my money for? This model is really beautiful. Akash in my office made it. It's maple and walnut, and we just had a very crude sketch of what the plan could be in the rock there in the center. And I knew I had to capture this idea in a physical way besides the watercolors, or I might lose the project. So we had this idea to cut up a bunch of maple to make the site, and then make the house and the rock like one thing that's kind of geologically interconnected under the surface, like the tip of an iceberg. So at the end of the first presentation, I unboxed this big thing, and I reached and grabbed the house and pulled it out like a geological boring sample. And client pulled his cell phone out and started recording it. I was like, okay, good. I'm not going to get fired. That's good. And this house was, yeah, just incredible experience, great site, tremendous amount of work with civil engineers to get all the setbacks dealt with. So literally 3 rounds of staking to get all the geometry right, so you didn't have this rock coming into the middle of the circulation or coming through a wall. Just, I couldn't quite go Albert Frey with the presence of the rock given the budget. But it turned out to be an awesome house. A guest house got added. These are some early drawings that try to capture the essence of this house, maybe giving a sense of something that rests beneath the surface of the site. And it's all was going to be all rough sawn cedar left to silver naturally, so it almost looked like stone or concrete when you're driving up in the fog. This is the courtyard. The house literally scribes that lava outflow. And the view from the living room. We had fun developing casework details to kind of almost feel like your rock climbing wall, which, there's a fine line between being too, I don't know if I crossed it, but this house had a lot of freedoms that I have not felt from other projects. And then in the end, these are the kids' bedrooms on the back looking into the woods. Then in the end, on the third staking and the permit was issued, I got a call from the client. He said, "Hey, Dan, I love this house, but we're moving to Phoenix." And so that's an architecture is hard lesson right there. It's an amazing client, amazing house. And the staking had been perfect. This was standing right at the entry where you first see the rock through the corridor. And it's always shrouded in this mist up at the top. I mean, the sunny days you can see the water, but there's this incredible atmosphere up there. So I know it's not lost. It'll show up in hopefully maybe even a house in Phoenix. We'll see. This last project, I feel like I arranged this. This is almost like in some ways like a homecoming project, even though it's not here. This is a project for an amazing client, Steve, who's actually my friend now. I can't say that for every single client. And he wrote me, and I actually got to tell the story later. He wrote me, he said, "Hey, I know you're a Northwest architect, but do you want to do a desert house?" I'm like, oh, and it was amazing. It was literally, as I was taking an Uber to some kind of networking thing that I did not want to go to, but I didn't have any work. I was freaking out. Like with that house stopping all of a sudden before CA, I was like, I gotta find a project. So I went to this thing, I checked my email, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to this thing. And I was like, I actually am available to talk right now. And called, and I went down to Joshua Tree with him and saw his site. And we went to Pappy and Harriet's the first night, which was a great place there near Joshua Tree. And he had told me, I want an all concrete house. I want it to be up in the desert alone. And then we started talking about budgets. And I was like, oh my gosh, you can't have a concrete house. Like you're getting a 2x4 house. Like we gotta, you're off grid in every single way. You're up halfway up a mountain. And so we had a great time the next day, like trying to come to grips with reality there by trespassing on construction sites, seeing what people were doing and talking to builders. If there was someone on the site, it's like, oh yeah, where are you getting your lumber from? Where are you getting your stucco work from? So this project, even though it's not mass, I think a lot of things that I saw here, including that courtyard at the Tucson Herb Store, subconsciously made their way into this project. The project's located right here. It's completely off grid. It's up this road that you got to be very careful driving up. It's on the north face of a pretty big mountain just north of Joshua Tree National Park. Huge boulders, creosote, no trees, not even a Joshua tree on the site. It's an extremely rugged site. So the process, this one, as far as the search began with playing the Joshua Tree album from U2 so many times that I think my office mates wanted to kill me. Listening to Calexico and other things that I heard in the office here at Rick's office, just trying to, it's raining outside, there's evergreen trees, and we're trying to conjure up the spirit of what a desert sanctuary could be. Just quite a bit of drawing of what the site was, because I never worked in any context like this. Felt like Mars, honestly. So just coming to grips with the terrain. Quickly, a plan scheme started to emerge. I knew that his family would like to use the house while he would use it. So quickly, one larger and one smaller pavilion emerged. With the service, there's a little bit of a flat part of the site down here. You get amazing sunset range here, sunrise, and thankfully protected by the mountain in the most harsh months. So we kind of built into the bowl just up above the somewhat flat part of the site here. And then quickly, as my wife knows, I am not a naturally desert person. And he was telling me about all the outdoor showers he wanted. And I'm not gonna like take an outdoor shower and step on a rattlesnake in the dark one night. So I had the idea of, this is fun too. This is the first time where I'm not the best model maker, but I just picked up a bunch of materials and we had the music going and listening to all kinds of stuff like Caius and Queens of the Stone Age and Calexico, just trying to get in touch with the desert atmosphere and just freehanding models randomly in the office, just playing with physical things to balance out the drawings, just to be free. And I think there was quite a bit of DNA for this project, and there are some more watercolors. So quickly, you can see on the left, there's no courtyard here yet. But then this sketch here, I realized, oh, why not let it continue to be two masses, but unify it with a courtyard? Just so there's a place where you can walk around and not worry what you're going to step on necessarily. But also have a safe place for the pool. California has all these crazy rules about pools and people falling in them. And the light was so intense there. It's like, how do we, even though we're not building with real mass, how can we capture light and make this place like a mountain sanctuary that really celebrates the surplus of light that there is and brings it in a very delicate way to create an almost spiritual atmosphere in this place once you negotiate the journey to get to it. I see more sketches of the courtyard starting to emerge early in the watercolors. This is the second house where it's like, okay, we got to do all the drawings by hand at the beginning. And this is also the first time, I think, in reaction to the Madrona house. I like the Madrona house, but I realized that I didn't make enough scales to pull away from being social in the house. I didn't make enough places for like one person to go away and read something in peace, etc. So the plan here at the ends, you come into the courtyard, and another thing too, given that it's fairly small spaces, the idea, instead of having a straight shot circulation, this is kind of a meander plan where you enter on axis with a fire and you move around to make your way into the more private zones. You end up at a desk looking into the rocks, and then you turn finally into a bathroom with an outdoor courtyard. We tried to repeat it going the other way, but really trying to make a meander and plan, which was fun. And we'll see once it goes into construction if it works as good as I hope. So this is another thing from 4th Avenue. I realized both of these things. There's a used bookstore there. I don't know if it's still there, but one day I was in there looking at books on a weekend when I lived here, and there is this big poster. I can't remember, it was like Grand Canyon Jazz Festival or something. It had this amazing painting on it. And I looked up the painter's name. His name was Ed Mell. And kind of, like a little bit like, I'm sure people in Arizona maybe don't take it totally seriously, but like a little poppiness to it. But I read about the guy who grew up in Arizona and went to New York and studied Art Deco graphic design. Came back to Arizona, and he had a friend with a helicopter that would drop him off on plateaus. He lived in Phoenix, but he went all over the Southwest, and he'd get dropped on these rock formations for like hours at a time to do these sketches. And then he'd come back and draft them. So we tried to conjure up some of that attitude in the renderings to create these kind of storytelling collages that are different from the renderings. And then there are some renderings. So this should break ground here in the next couple months, which is exciting. Come in here to the courtyard with a pool. You can go to the left into the main house, right into the guests. And then there's a stargazing deck on the roof. And it's all thick aggregate, heavy dash stucco, just on 2x6s, but trying to create a sense of thickness, mass, and almost a spiritual atmosphere inside. It's the view over the valley from the bedroom. And then we made this 3/8 scale model for the final design meeting. We were putting the permits in, and this was awesome. And I actually flew down to Joshua Tree with this. And that does a much better job than the renderings. And this stucco was applied with a toothbrush in the parking lot behind our office everywhere. There's Frank Gehry sitting on the bench. And there's the roof. And that's the end. And I just want to say thank you to Jason and Akos, who work with me on all this stuff. Stuff is all a team effort, and I wouldn't be able to do it without them. And thank you for listening.
Dan, thank you. I forgot to mention, I always speak too quickly at the beginning, but earlier we were walking to get a coffee, and we were at the stoplight, and you asked me, why'd you invite me? Well, the reason is because I was excited by your work, and I knew the connection and I knew the lineage. And something that we're trying to do with this, the architecture of design, is revealing some of these stories. And so you can only imagine how excited then I was when you sent over the project photos that you sent, which weren't photos, collages. I was excited again. And then you sent the prompt of the search. And I thought, how fitting is that? And, so testing. Hello? Testing. No, anyways, excited about the work. Mentioned earlier that you're on.
Oh, can you say it again?
Hello.
Hi.
There was a sketch that you created that was within the order part of your presentation, and it looked a lot like the Haussmann buildings that are seen throughout Paris. And I wanted to know if you took inspo from George Haussmann when you were designing that.
Oh. I think the only drawing in the order section, was it the one that's terraced or the one that's got the rusty guy that's horizontal? Okay, yeah, I think you kind of mean the stepped one. Haussmann, I'm not directly, but I think that the time spent in Berlin and Paris for sure has influenced the housing quite a bit. And even though I'm building in wood and very different material cultures from those points in history and those places in Europe, I think more so in that project, one of the things that's been a major influence is looking at how post-war social housing in Britain has all of a sudden become cool again for the generation that we're in now, when it had a pretty negative stigma for a long time. And you should look that up. Look up council housing, modern brutalist London or something. And there's such an incredible energy behind the housing schemes at that point in history. Some of them not so great, some of them incredible. But it's just interesting for me. We had a chance to visit London a couple years ago and to see these places that when I was in architecture school, people were sick of post-World War II rapid concrete housing. But I think that Britain did it in a very special way where now people are realizing that actually the architecture of housing done in that period is still very desirable to live in. And I think that that has been probably the biggest influence on that project.
Questions?
So the house that you were designing in by the Puget that ended up moving to Phoenix, what happened? Like, is that just sitting on a bookshelf somewhere?
I don't know where the model is. That's a bummer. Um, it's in the town that it's in. You would be shocked to find a house like that. I would say it's in kind of a bureaucratic center of Washington. It's in the capital city, and there's not a lot of modern architecture since, unless you count like 1950s government buildings in the capital sector. So it's kind of a hard place. And also that house was so specifically designed to the awesome original client that approached me first. It was so tailored to discussions we'd had and his love of things that were a little bit, I'd say, non-linear and things that, you know, he is a neurosurgeon and he'd be building the craziest stuff in his garage every time I'd meet with him. So I think that, yeah, I don't know what's ever going to happen to it. The lot has sold twice. It is riddled with incredible amount of jurisdictional work to get that house to work. So it just sold again a few months ago. So it's yet to be seen what will happen, but I've kind of accepted that project might just have to live on as an unbuilt project that shows up in another way in a future project.
Hey, thanks for a beautiful presentation. Really optimistic and inspirational. I have two questions. You mentioned you feeling the responsibility of shaping the neighborhood with the housing project. And the first question goes towards, you haven't really mentioned parking, which seems to be a big conversation in any developments that are larger scale in Tucson.
Yeah.
Where parking sometimes just simply makes people who are optimistically trying to do something shy away from a project.
Right.
And then the second, which is maybe not so much a question, but I haven't seen you talk about it, and I wonder how you resolved that, which with a multi-story, multi-family housing project, which would be one. And the second is, you've mentioned the developer having become a partner. Having become a partner in the process.
Yeah.
And so feeling the responsibility of shaping a neighborhood, do you see yourself shifting also into co-defining, legislation scope of city responsibility that will help other architects go more easily into those type of projects? So these two would be interesting to get in.
Yeah.
Conversational.
Very, very good question. I'll take the easier one to answer first, is the parking one. Portland, last March, I'm sure Tucson must be in a housing crisis as well as the rest of the nation. Portland is in a severe housing crisis. There's a lot of people still moving there, and there has been a massive slowdown at all scales of housing construction. So the city passed a bunch of zoning bylaws that basically did away with parking in the inner city, which shocked me a little bit, because also as a participant in the city, I don't want to overwhelm these little side streets where single family residences have been for a century, and all of a sudden they're not able to park in front of their homes, et cetera. So there's been a lot of discussion, I'd say particularly in the more horizontal project where there's going to be 60 units. We had surface parking in that middle courtyard in the beginning, and actually the developer, full disclosure, I thought we gotta have some kind of parking here, or we're gonna overwhelm the neighborhood with all these new people. And the developer was like, I don't want to do parking. Like it's on a major public transit street. People are obsessed with biking in Portland. Let's just not have parking. And then at the first city planning meeting that we showed, we had, by the time you put the ADA parking in and the access and the turnaround, we had like 6 spots for 60 units. And the planning commission was like, why do you have those parking spots here? You should just totally do away with it. We see projects coming in right now twice the size with no parking. So that's been a kind of a shocking thing for me even. But it's people in the neighborhood seem to be supportive of it. And actually, Portland is a very progressive place. So I'm amazed by, sometimes I'll be hanging out on the site doing CA and someone will stop and, oh, are you the framer, or what are you doing here? And I'm like, no, I'm the architect. I'm like hoping they're not going to yell at me. And they're like, oh, we love this. And I love that there's no parking. Like, this is how Portland should evolve. Like, we should just do away with parking. So and then the other one, the more terraced one, that one is on a much more built up mixed use corridor where I'd say half the new buildings haven't had parking for a decade. So Portland is really trying to push multimodal public transportation. And we have not incredible, but we already have quite a bit of amazing systems, from light rail to bus to bike. So that's been something outside my prerogative, actually. It's been pushed on me. Now, building a neighborhood and shaping policy, I don't know. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I can do, or that I've had feedback from other architects so far, has actually been awesome. That one that's under construction, a lot of architects that were my teachers live up in that neighborhood. So I always get, kind of nasty joke, like people telling me they're going to put graffiti all over my building this weekend, et cetera. But a lot of people have been really encouraging of like what we've been able to do, because they know the budgets and the constraints that are on that scale of development. So I think the best thing I can do right now is just try and do the best possible to raise the bar a little bit, because a lot of the stuff that's in that type and scale of development in Portland is done by much bigger developers from out of state, and it's all hardy panel and it's all banged out really quick, and there's not really an organizing strategy to the architecture itself, and there's definitely not people out there lining up fastener heads and things like that. So I think as a starting point is just trying to serve as an example and a role model, and then in a very boring sense, there's been a lot of building code appeals that we've had to go through, and those get registered into a public domain website at the city. So the next person that wants to do exterior walkways instead of a single loaded hallway can go and find all the appeals that we were able to successfully complete. So yeah, we'll see. Hopefully all good.
Other question?
You mentioned a few times the challenges that come with designing for a location or a region that you are unfamiliar with. Well, as students who are predominantly designing in a desert environment, because we're in Tucson, do you have any advice or anything we should keep in mind just as we go through our education, thinking about other regions and environment and designing for them?
I can't remember where I read this. Might have been from an interview with Rick, or maybe someone else that started in a much more regional practice. You can tell me if I'm wrong, Rick. But someone said if you dig deep into where you're at and you work deeply and closely with the context that you're in, and you get rooted there, those skills of the connection of being rooted to your place, when given the opportunity to work in a different place, those go with you. I'd never heard that before, and I probably just butchered it, but it more or less to me said, work in Portland and know Portland, know the history, know the culture, know the traditions and history of architecture, know the people that came before you that did work that resonates with you, and try to not copy that, but grow the successes of those things, or the things that resonate with you the deepest in that specific place you're in. And don't worry, when you get an opportunity to work in a different place, you'll have already grown a kind of intrinsic skill set that you'll be able to apply to a totally different place. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just focus here while you're here, and then you see where life puts you next.
Dan, I have a question to follow that up for the students here. Can you speak to the relationship that you have discovered or found along the way between luck, opportunity, and rigor? I say rigor because even Rick brought it up that, you know, he would give you more attention because you had more stuff. So speaking to the students, if you can talk about that really, and then also that you mentioned you're doing housing, but you've never done a housing studio. So
Yeah.
luck, opportunity, but then also the rigor that we read in the work.
Luck, opportunity, and rigor. I would say, yes, luck. Been very fortunate and blessed to everything that's happened in my career. I think personally, this is something I'll say that might encourage people. I felt in undergrad, I always knew, like, I want to be a great architect. Like, I have to be a great architect. That's what I'm gonna do. I knew that, like, in junior high. An aunt that I think is watching on Zoom gave me a book on falling water, and I was hooked. I thought I was going to draw comic books for a living before I saw that. And I think I got a little brainwashed by Frank Lloyd Wright books as a kid, but also very inspired. But I felt through undergrad that my skill set was not leveling up to where I wanted to be. I would just, you know, I felt like the ambition and the drive, but I didn't feel like my design skills were where I wanted them to be at. And I mean, I still feel that way. It's a lifetime pursuit of trying to get better at your craft. But every time an opportunity came up, and I think the first real big one was that Miami project where I got a ticket, showed up in my school email, and I went down to Miami, and it was just to talk about alleys for a day and fly back. But I was like, no, I got to sit down and show them that I could design something. And I think my mom was a big motivator in that. When I was young, she would always push me to, you know, go make a connection. If you're really into that, then I wanted to be a veterinarian at one point. I remember she found someone that was a veterinarian and had me go shadow them at, like, in 5th grade or something. I saw like some dissected boa constrictor. I was like, I don't want to do that. That's nasty. But my mom really pushed me to, like, when I first mentioned architecture, you know, I was really into skateboarding at the time. And on top of all my, like, Thrasher magazine, she had like 10 architecture books from the library on top. So you got to read those before you can read the skate magazines. So I think that seeking out and not letting an opportunity go to waste, that's been something from childhood, just to try and get somewhere different. Luck is implicit to that. There's a bunch of stuff that I'm not showing or talking about that was painful and did not work out so well. But I have been very fortunate, especially only being 5 years into practice now, to have these opportunities. And then the rigor, this is funny. When I studied in Germany, in Berlin, I think people in the studio admired my work, but they would always say, like, oh, your stuff is so American. Your stuff is so American. And I didn't understand that. And then I kind of started to understand. Basically, they were like, you don't have discipline in what you're designing. Like, you're doing too much. I would always be like, oh, look at this. Maybe this stair could have this detail, the precast concrete tread exposed, you know, like just going too crazy on everything. And I remember as a birthday present, it was a huge studio, the Technical University of Berlin. It was like the biggest architecture school I'd ever been in. It's just like armies of students. They have a studio that's dedicated just to healthcare. So they have like building types by floor. It's crazy. But some of the guys in the studio got together and got me a John Pawson book for my birthday. Like, you need to look at this more. You need to calm down. And I think that year in Berlin was really the time where I started trying to distill in a way that I'd never done before. And like, even at my final review in Rick's studio, I talked with Mac Scoggin afterward, and he's like, you got a lot of ideas, but you got to learn to filter out the best ones. And that was really like a, kind of a painful thing to hear, but it challenged me deeply. And I feel like I'm still working at that, like how to peel away peel away everything to its essence as much as possible. And that's where the rigor comes, I think.
Dan, thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. March 3rd, we'll be joined by Lorcan O'Hurley, and we'll be here in CCP. Thank you.